poor rancher saved 2 Apache sisters, their chief's fate in Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. After the storm, Ezekiel Marsh, a weary rancher, stood among broken fences, blood staining his hands. At his gate, 2 dying Apache sisters met his gaze with desperate eyes. Through a long night of silence, fever, and the distant thud of hooves at dawn, he learned, on the frontier, mercy, not bullets, keeps a man standing. A storm left his ranch in ruins, but what it left inside Ezekiel Marsh weighed heavier than broken fences. The storm had rolled off like a beast that had eaten its fill. Morning found Ezekiel Marsh standing on the porch his father had built, listening to the roof drip into a rusted pan. Out in the pasture, fence posts leaned like tired soldiers, pushed crooked by the wind. The earth smelled of wet clay and rotting hay. No voices, no laughter, just the hollow hush of land after a storm. He was no young man anymore. His back carried the weight of too many furrows, his knees stiff from years of walking plowed ground. The skin on his palms was hard as saddle leather left too long in the sun. Every morning, he brewed bitter coffee from rainwater, poured it into a chipped enamel cup, and watched the steam drift away like things he could never hold. Inside, nothing had changed in years. The wool coat hung over the chair, the rifle rested by the window, the lamp glass smoked and cloudy from use. Ezekiel checked the latch, the habit of a man who knew both weather and men could turn without warning. He told himself it was an ordinary day. Saying it out loud didn't make it true, but it kept him steady. By the corral, he found a calf lying still in the mud. He stood looking at it for a long while, waiting as though the little body might rise. When it didn't, he pulled an old blanket over it, dragged it out of the wet, and said nothing. Not grief, not anger, just that slow settling of a man who knows life takes more than it gives. The ledger sat on a shelf by the door. Last night, he'd counted nails, tallied bushels, measured how thin next season might run. Numbers don't bend, and the numbers said the year would be lean. He slipped the book into his coat pocket, like a man tucking away a pistol he hoped not to use. The north ridge lay dark against the pale sky, jagged as a wolf's teeth. Ezekiel took up his hammer and wire, walked the fence line, and set each post with patient blows. The ground was soft from rain. His boots sank deep. Each strike of the hammer echoed across the emptiness, a work song with no singer but him. Now and then, he stopped, watching scraps of cloud tear across the sky. Out here, a man was small, but sometimes small was enough to tip the weight of choice. He felt it low in his chest, a quiet wanting he couldn't name, like a farmer at market with empty pockets, still hoping to come home with something that mattered. The old saddle still lay across the rail, straps worn dark, stitching frayed. The horse that once carried it had died the summer before. Ezekiel walked more now, slower, noticing things he'd missed before. The rasp of grasshoppers, the rattle of loose boards, the dry cry of coyotes after dusk. They weren't stories, just reminders that the land was still alive. He lingered on the porch before stepping back inside. The ground was scarred with rainwater paths, his boot prints from the night before. A blackbird swooped, plucked something from the mud, and vanished into the gray. The smell of wet soil was honest. It spoke of loss and of seed in the same breath. He let out a long breath, not surrender, just the steady sigh of a man laying another stone on the levee that kept him upright. What he carried in his chest had no name. It wasn't riches he longed for, and not peace exactly. Just the hope that one day, standing in this same yard, he might know he had touched something beyond numbers in a ledger. Maybe a hand offered when no one else would. Maybe the weight of another's eyes that didn't look away. Maybe some small kindness, uncounted but real. He didn't pray for it. He just drove the last nail into a leaning post, slung the hammer across his shoulder, and walked slow back toward the cabin, where the faint smell of smoke still hung, whispering that a new day had begun, even if no one spoke his name in the silence. Day after day, he patched wood and wire, holding on to a life thinner than his cattle's ribs. Morning came thin and gray. light breaking across the valley like it was ashamed to stay. Ezekiel Marsh set his shoulders and moved through the chores that marked the hours, the same as his father before him. Routine was what held a man together when everything else frayed. He lifted the latch on the feed shed, the wood swollen with rain. Inside, the grain sacks sagged half empty, the smell of mold beginning to creep in. He scooped with his tin pail anyway, the hollow scrape ringing out in the silence. A man couldn't leave stock unfed, even if he knew it wouldn't be enough. The yard was slick, mud sucking at his boots. He spread feed by habit, though the cattle moved slow, ribs showing like fence rails beneath hide. They chewed without hurry, eyes dull, the way a man eats when hope has gone out of him. Ezekiel leaned against a post, watching them. He didn't talk to them the way some ranchers did. Words were precious, best saved for moments when silence was too heavy to bear. A wind moved through, dragging dust where yesterday's rain had already vanished into thirsty earth. From the porch, the house looked weary, boards gone gray, roof patched more times than he cared to count. Still, it was a roof, and it was his. That counted for something in a country where men lost everything faster than they gained it. By mid-morning, the sky cleared. Sunlight glared off puddles scattered like mirrors across the yard. Ezekiel took his hat off, wiped his brow with a sleeve, and stood for a spell, just listening. A crow called from the ridge, sharp and lonesome, the kind of sound that makes a man think of distances too wide to cross. He walked the fence line again, not because he needed to, but because work was the only answer to quiet. Each broken slat was another place to put his hands, another reason to stay moving. He set posts straight, pulled wire tight, struck nails with steady blows. Sweat ran down his back, drying quick in the wind. At the far edge of the pasture, he paused. The land spread out ahead of him, endless and bare, its silence larger than words. That was the kind of silence that pressed against a man, asking questions he had no answers for. He spat in the dirt, hitched his belt, and turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the place smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Ezekiel set the kettle on, filled it with what rainwater he'd collected. He watched the flame catch, small and stubborn, and thought how a man's life wasn't much different, burning low, yet holding on. He sat at the table with his ledger again, thumbed through the pages without really seeing them. The figures were there, same as always, sharp and unforgiving. But he didn't linger on them this time. His eyes drifted to the window instead, where the light fell slant across the yard, picking out each flaw, each scar of the storm. That was the rhythm of the place. Mend, feed, wait, endure. Nothing changed except the sky overhead. And yet, beneath that rhythm, there lived a hollow wanting, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, something would come along to break the sameness, to remind him he was still a man with more to give than sweat and silence. For now, though, Ezekiel set his jaw and carried on. The fence would need mending tomorrow. The roof would leak again with the next rain, and he would still be here, one man against a land that never gave quarter. But as he stepped out once more, hammer in hand, he couldn't shake the sense that somewhere beyond the ridge, the world was shifting, that the wind carried not just dust, but change. It was a faint thing, nearly nothing at all, yet it made him pause in the yard, turn his face toward the horizon, and listen longer than he meant to. Then he found two bodies at his fence line, breathing still, but branded with danger. By late afternoon, the land had gone quiet in that uneasy way it does when a storm has passed, but left its weight behind. The air was still heavy, smelling of wet cedar and churned earth. Ezekiel Marsh walked the yard slow, checking fence lines one more time before dusk. Habit, nothing more. He kept his head down, watching the mud cling to his boots. It was then he saw them. At first, just a tangle of shape and color caught against the broken fence. Beadwork dulled by rain, dark hair matted with dust, cloth torn and heavy with blood. He thought it debris washed down from the ridge. But as he drew closer, the shapes resolved into what no rancher expected to find on his land. Two bodies still breathing. They were women, Apache, larger than any he'd ever seen. Even lying there, their frames stretched long and broad, shoulders built for battle or labor that would have broken a settler's man in half. One stirred faintly, a low breath rattling her chest. The other lay still, her skin gray under the grime. Ezekiel froze where he stood, hand tight around the hammer still hanging from his belt. His mind turned quick as a coyote on the run. Apache here meant trouble, meant war parties not far behind, meant neighbors whispering of betrayal. Every instinct, born of survival, told him one thing: walk away. But his boots wouldn't move. The smaller of the two opened her eyes, dark as midnight, searching and unfocused. No hatred there, none of the fierce fire the stories spoke of. Only the hollow terror of one who knows death is already reaching. Her lips parted, no words coming, just the faint scrape of breath before they closed again. Ezekiel felt the weight of silence press down on him harder than any law. He thought of the calf he'd covered with a blanket that morning, how easy it had been to turn away from a creature already gone. These women weren't gone yet, and the fence that hemmed them in, broken as it was, seemed to draw a line right through his chest. The hammer slipped from his fingers, landing in the mud with a dull thud. He crouched beside them, close enough to smell sweat and iron, close enough to see the raw edges of their wounds. His hand hovered in the air, trembling, caught between fear of what helping would bring and fear of what not helping would make him. No voices called from the hills. No riders appeared on the ridge. Just the sigh of wind moving across broken posts and the faint, labored rhythm of breath that could end at any moment. Ezekiel drew in a slow breath of his own, tasting the mud and rain on his tongue. Then, with the steadiness of a man who knows there's no turning back once he starts, he slid his arms beneath the nearer woman's shoulders. Her weight was staggering, her body all muscle and bone, but he bore it in silence. The other lay motionless, save for the rise and fall of her chest. He glanced toward the cabin, then back at the horizon. No sign of anyone, no sound, but the restless scrape of branches against the barn wall. What he did next would brand him a fool or a man worth remembering, though no one might ever know. All he felt was the old fence line splitting in two. On one side, safety. On the other, mercy. And for the first time in years, Ezekiel Marsh stepped across. In their fevered faces, he saw the ghost of his own sister, long buried by winter. Ezekiel staggered beneath the woman's weight, her breath faint against his shoulder. He lowered her just inside the barn door, where the ground was dry and cool. The second one still lay by the broken fence, body slack, head turned as if listening to some voice he couldn't hear. For a moment, he stood between them and the open yard, chest rising heavy. The silence of the land pressed in. He had crossed a line already, but the worst of it wasn't danger. It was memory. Kneeling beside the still one, he brushed damp hair back from her brow. The gesture surprised him. His hand hadn't moved that way in years. Her skin burned with fever, sweat beading despite the chill of evening. He fetched a bucket, dipped it in the water trough, and wrung out a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. When he touched it to her forehead, a memory struck clean through him: Elizabeth. His sister had been 14 the winter fever came. He remembered her small frame shivering under piled quilts, her eyes searching his like they held one last question he could not answer. He had sat at her bedside then, cloth in hand, just as he did now. And when the fever carried her away, he had been left with nothing but the sound of her breath fading in the dark. Looking down at the Apache woman, he felt that same helplessness rise again, sharp as glass. It was as if time had folded back on itself and given him another chance, though not with the sister he had lost, but with strangers the world told him to fear. The woman stirred, lips parting. A sound came, not words, just the rasp of effort. Her eyes opened a sliver. In them, he saw not enemy, not legend, but a reflection of himself, someone clinging by a thread, waiting to see if anyone cared enough to hold on. His hand tightened on the damp cloth. He couldn't save Elizabeth. He had carried that weight like a stone ever since, pressing it down deep where no one could see. But here, in this quiet barn with the scent of hay and wet earth, The stone shifted. He didn't speak. Words would have broken something fragile in the air. Instead, he dipped the cloth again, laid it gentle against her skin, and sat back on his heels. Outside, the last light of day spilled across the valley, painting the broken fence in long shadows. The land was still the same, hard, silent, unforgiving. Yet in that moment, it seemed to offer him a mirror, not one of glass, but of flesh and bone, fever and breath, a reminder that sorrow was not his alone, and that mercy, once withheld, can sometimes be given again. Ezekiel stayed there, keeping watch, as if by guarding her he might guard the memory of his sister too. The barn grew darker, the world quieter, until only the sound of breathing, hers and his, remained. With trembling hands, he gave strangers water and firelight as if they were kin. Night fell slow, the kind of darkness that doesn't rush but settles grain by grain, until the valley disappeared under its weight. Ezekiel lit the lamp in the cabin, the flame wavering against glass, clouded by years of smoke. He carried the light back to the barn, careful not to spill, careful not to wake whatever shadows lived beyond the ridge. The two women lay where he had placed them, their sighs filling the small space, their presence turning the barn into something both sanctuary and snare. He set the lamp on a crate, its glow spilling across rough-hewn beams and hay scattered from the storm. He fetched water from the barrel, poured it into a tin cup, and pressed it to the lips of the one whose eyes had fluttered earlier. At first nothing, then a swallow. Slow, labored, but real. He held the cup steady, his hand trembling not from fear, but from the weight of it all. The other woman shifted in her sleep, a sound rising low from her chest. Ezekiel laid a blanket over her, one of his own. Thin, patched in places, it barely covered her frame, yet he tucked it in as if she were kin. It was a foolish act, perhaps, but he did it the way a man mends fence rails, because it was what needed doing, whether or not it held. When the chores of mercy were done, he sank onto the stool near the door. The hammer still lay in the mud outside, forgotten, while his rifle leaned within reach. He looked from one to the other, and then to the women, and thought of how often a man's choices could be measured in such small distances. The barn smelled of hay and damp leather, of blood and wood smoke carried in on his coat. Beyond the walls, the coyotes began their chorus, sharp and hungry, their cries carried on the wind. Ezekiel listened, unmoving, the lamp painting half his face in gold and leaving the other half to shadow. He did not speak. There was no one to hear. Instead, he moved through small, steady tasks, the kind a man does when he's afraid of stopping. He checked the fire in the stove, trimmed the lamp wick, poured what was left of the coffee into a cup, though it had gone cold. Each act quiet, deliberate, like pebbles laid across a stream to keep him from sinking. When one of the women stirred again, he rose, dipped the cloth into water, and pressed it to her skin. Her breath eased a fraction, enough to ease his own. He set the cup down, sat back, and folded his hands against his knees. No one would know of these gestures. No one would count them in any ledger. Yet, they were the only truth he had left to give, that when faced with the weight of another's suffering, his hands had moved, not away, but toward. The night deepened. The wind rattled loose boards. Ezekiel kept his post, shoulders bent, eyes heavy, a lone figure guarding strangers. It was nothing grand, nothing men would sing about around fires. Just a man and the small acts of kindness that held back the dark, if only for a while. Through a night thick with coyotes and fear, he kept the watch no one else could see. The night stretched long, drawn out like rawhide, pulled slow through a gloved hand. Ezekiel sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, lamp turned low inside so the glow would not carry too far. The barn door was shut, but his ears stayed tuned to every creak of wood, every shift of wind across the open land. The coyotes called again, farther off now, their sharp notes swallowed by the wide emptiness. A horse snorted somewhere on the ridge, or maybe it was just his memory of such sounds. Out here, a man couldn't always tell if what he heard was real or only his fear making noise. He rose once, boots dragging through the dirt, and stepped inside the barn. The women slept, their breath shallow but steady. One's fever had eased. The cloth he'd laid across her brow had dried warm. He dipped it fresh, wrung it out slow, and placed it again. The other stirred, her chest rising heavy under the patched blanket. No words, no eyes opening, only the faint tremor of life clinging on. Ezekiel knelt a while beside them. His hand brushed a strand of hair from the smaller one's face, a motion quiet as prayer. Then he sat back against the stall post, let the chill of the earth settle into his bones, and listened to the rhythm of their breathing. It carried him back to other nights, when he had sat watch by his sister's bed, candle guttering low, hope slipping away grain by grain. He had failed then. Tonight, perhaps, was no different. Still, he kept the watch, because some failures were worse than death, and walking away would be one of them. Hours passed. He tended the fire in the cabin, then returned again to the barn. He moved like a shadow, his chores stripped down to the simplest motions. Check the water, stir the coals, tighten the blanket. The quiet became its own companion, steady as a heartbeat. Toward midnight, the wind shifted. It carried a smell he knew well, dust, dry and bitter, lifted from far-off ridges. He stepped outside and scanned the horizon. Nothing moved, no lanterns, no riders, only the land lying still under a thin moon. Yet the smell stayed, a whisper that the world beyond his fence had not forgotten him. He leaned against the porch post, eyes on the stars that cut the black sky open. A man could lose himself staring up there, each light older than memory, older than grief. He thought of his father's voice telling him that stars were markers, points to guide a rider home. Ezekiel wondered what home meant now, when all he had was this ground and two strangers sleeping under his roof. The hours dragged. He drank the last of the cold coffee, chewed a strip of jerky, though his mouth was dry. He forced his body to stay upright, though his bones begged for rest. The land gave no sign of danger, but neither did it grant peace. It only asked the same question over and over. Would he hold to this choice until the end? When the first light of dawn touched the ridge, Ezekiel was still there, eyes burning, rifle heavy in his lap. He had kept the watch, not because he believed it would save him, but because it was the only way he knew to be a man still worth the name. At dawn, the riders appeared on the ridge, their silence heavier than gunfire. The first wash of dawn crept slow over the valley, painting the wet earth in muted gold. Ezekiel Marsh straightened his back, stiff from the long night. His rifle still lay across his knees, hands numb where they had gripped the stock too long. He had not slept, not truly. He had only drifted in and out of that weary half-dream men know when they dare not let go completely. The cattle moved in the distance, low shapes stirring against the pale horizon. The land held its breath. And then, on the far ridge, the figures appeared. 5 riders, silent, mounted against the light of morning. Apache. Their ponies picked careful steps along the high ground, heads tossing steam into the cold air. They didn't rush, didn't call. They simply stood there, watching. Dark shapes carved sharp against the rising sun. Ezekiel's throat tightened. He had known they would come. It was only a question of when. He rose slow, leaned his rifle against the porch post, and let his hands hang empty at his sides. Out here, gestures spoke louder than words. The riders did not move closer. They held the ridge like sentinels. Then one dismounted, a man broad in the shoulders, hair braided long, face shadowed with paint faded by weather. He led his horse down the slope, each step deliberate, the others waiting behind. His presence carried weight, not from the weapons slung across his chest, but from the quiet authority that seemed to walk with him. Ezekiel felt the air change as the man approached the yard. It was the kind of silence that pressed down harder than any shout, the kind that measured a man before he even spoke. He thought of the women in his barn, still breathing, still clinging to life. He thought of the fence line broken by storm, the blanket drawn over a dead calf. All of it seemed small now in the shadow of that gaze drawing near. The Apache chief stopped just beyond the gate. He did not raise his voice, did not brandish steel. He only stood, his eyes moving from Ezekiel to the barn door and back again, eyes steady, unreadable, but carrying a weight that made Ezekiel's chest hollow out. Ezekiel did not speak. There were no words that could hold back what was coming. Instead, he lifted his chin the barest inch, as if to say, "I am here. Do what you will." The chief's gaze lingered, heavy as stone. For a long moment, the dawn itself seemed caught between them. The pale sun, the dust, the breath of the land. No judgment passed, no mercy given, not yet. Just the stillness of two men, one on either side of a broken yard, and the knowledge that whatever decision fell next would carry more weight than either could lift alone. The chief did not move closer. He only gave a single nod, slow, deliberate, impossible to read. Then he turned back toward his horse, the leather creaking as he swung into the saddle. On the ridge, the other riders sat waiting, silent as the stones. Ezekiel's hands curled tight against his sides. His heart beat heavy, though nothing had yet been said. It was the kind of silence that could be mercy or warning. Either way, it was not over. A single nod from the Apache chief carried more weight than any bullet. The riders on the ridge turned their horses, slow as drifting shadows, and melted back into the rising sun. Only the chief remained a moment longer. He sat tall in his saddle, the morning light catching on the braids that framed his weathered face. Then, without a word, he guided his mount away. Silence fell hard across the yard. Ezekiel stood where he was, shoulders square but heavy, as if the nod the chief had given him carried the weight of a verdict not yet spoken. He felt it settle in his bones, the kind of silence a man doesn't forget. Inside the barn, the women stirred. The taller one, still weak from fever, pushed herself up on an elbow. Her sister helped her sit, movements slow, careful. Ezekiel stepped in and found himself face to face with them once more. The one who had opened her eyes earlier reached out, her hand broad, calloused, trembling. She rested it on his shoulder, the weight of it near staggering. No words, no thanks, just that heavy hand, pressing down with a gravity that went deeper than flesh. Ezekiel stood still, letting the touch linger, unsure whether it was blessing or burden. Perhaps it was both. The barn smelled of damp hay and smoke clinging to his coat. Light spilled through the cracks in the walls, strips of gold falling across their faces. The woman's eyes met his for an instant, not fierce, not pleading, only steady, as though she had seen something in him worth marking, even if he could not name it himself. Then she let go. The moment passed, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the creak of timbers settling. Ezekiel gathered the blankets closer around them, adjusted the lamp, then stepped back toward the open door. The yard lay empty again, the ridge quiet. A crow wheeled overhead, calling once before vanishing into the distance. Ezekiel rested his hand on the doorframe, staring out at the broken fence and the trampled mud where hooves had stood moments before. Nothing had changed, yet everything had shifted. He knew the danger had not passed. The nod of the chief was not the end, but the beginning of something heavier, something he could not yet see. Still, the hand on his shoulder had left a mark deeper than fear. For the first time in a long while, Ezekiel felt himself seen, not as a failing rancher, not as a man counting debts in a ledger, but as one human standing for another in a place where mercy was rare. He stepped back inside, closed the door against the morning wind, and sat down on the stool by the wall. The barn was still, save for the quiet breaths of two women whose lives now lay tangled with his. Ezekiel folded his hands, bowed his head, and let the silence rest between them, like an old hymn no one needed to sing aloud. And in the quiet that followed, Ezekiel learned mercy can steady a man more than law or steel. When the hoofbeats faded into distance and the dust settled back to earth, Ezekiel Marsh found himself alone again in his yard. The ridge stood bare, the sky washed pale with the slow rise of morning. He leaned against the post, feeling the stiffness in his knees, the weight in his shoulders, and yet a strange looseness in his chest, as if something long bound had been set free. He turned back toward the barn. Inside, the air was warmer now, heavy with the scent of hay, smoke, and breath. The women slept again, their faces no longer twisted with pain, but softened by rest. One shifted slightly under the blanket he had pulled across her frame. The other murmured low in her own tongue, then stilled, her hand falling open upon the straw. Ezekiel knelt to pick up his hammer from where it had dropped the day before. The head was caked with mud, the handle damp. He wiped it clean against his pant leg and set it aside. Tools belonged where they could be found when needed. Even in a world that bent toward chaos, a man could keep order in the little things. The fire in the cabin stove had burned low, leaving only coals, but enough to warm the small room when he stepped inside. 2 bowls sat on the table from the night before, empty but for a streak of broth clinging to the rim. He didn't clear them yet. Their presence was proof that life still moved in this house, that breath had been sustained here when it might have ended outside in the mud. Ezekiel poured what water remained into the kettle, set it over the coals, and listened to the faint hiss as heat met metal. He pulled a chair close, sat, and let the quiet seep into him. Outside, the land lay scarred but calm. The fences would need mending. The roof still leaked. Tomorrow's burdens waited. But here, in this hour, there was only stillness. He thought of the chief's nod, of the hand on his shoulder, heavy with unspoken meaning. He thought of his sister's face, long gone, yet nearer than ever. For the first time in many seasons, the memory did not slice at him. It rested, quiet as the breath of those who slept under his roof. The kettle began to steam. Ezekiel lifted it, poured dark coffee into his cup, and carried it to the porch. He sat with the cup warming his hands, watching the sun climb slow over the ridge. The light spilled across the broken land, turning mud to bronze and fence posts to dark lines stretching on and on. He drank, not for strength, not for wakefulness, but for the simple comfort of something hot on his tongue. He let his eyes wander across the horizon. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Lawmen, war parties, questions he couldn't answer. The world might yet demand payment for what he had chosen. But in this small moment, he felt lighter. Not safe, not victorious, just lighter. Because he had chosen mercy. Because he had not turned away. And sometimes, on land this hard, that was enough to keep a man alive in ways the world could never measure. Ezekiel Marsh set his cup down on the step, leaned back against the post, and closed his eyes. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, with memory, with breath, with the faint hope that comes when a man discovers he is not entirely alone. The West has always asked men to choose between fear and courage, between silence and kindness. Ezekiel Marsh didn't change the course of history that night. He didn't win riches, nor carve his name in stone. All he did was open his door, keep a watch, and carry the weight of mercy when it would have been easier to turn away. Maybe that's the heart of it. Out here, the fences will always break, storms will always come, and the years will keep taking more than they give. But a man can still decide what kind of soul he'll be when someone else's life leans against his own. And sometimes, that choice alone is enough to steady the ground beneath his boots. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a time you chose kindness, or wished someone had chosen it for you, I'd be honored to hear your thoughts. Share them if you like, in your own way, in your own words. The campfire is warmer when more voices gather around it.